The snow came down so hard and fast that Ida Fairchild could no longer see her own hand held out before her face. She pressed herself against the rock face of the mountain, her medical bag clutched to her chest like it was the only thing tethering her to life itself, because right now it very nearly was. Behind her, 3 people were counting on her. Ahead of her was nothing but a white wall of death. "It is sealed," the voice said from somewhere to her left. Jeremiah Watkins, all 6 feet 2 inches of frontier muscle and weathered certainty, pressed his gloved palm against the wall of packed snow and ice that had cascaded down across the Ridgecrest Pass like a curtain dropping on the final act of a tragic play. He turned to look at her, and she could see even through the howling blizzard that his dark eyes held something she had never expected to find in them: fear. Not for himself, for them. For the family of 4 huddled inside the inadequate shelter of a broken-down wagon 20 yards behind them. For the child inside that wagon whose fever was climbing past anything natural. There is no way through. The whole upper face came down. Could be 30, 40 feet of snow packed solid. Ida stared at the wall of white. She pressed her fingers against it, felt the cold seep through her leather gloves in seconds, felt the impossible density of it. Her mind was already moving even as her body went still. She was cataloging, calculating, cross-referencing every trail she had ever walked on this mountain, and she had walked every single one of them in the past 4 years because that was what a frontier healer did. She did not have the luxury of staying in one place. She turned away from the sealed pass and looked back down the mountain the way they had come. "I know another way," she said. Jeremiah looked at her as though she had just told him the moon had changed color. "There is no other way. I have ridden these mountains for 11 years, Ida. There is one pass and it is buried." She felt the familiar burn of being doubted, the old sting she had learned to carry the way other women carried grief. She did not fight it. She simply moved past it. "There is a lower trail," she said. "It runs along the south face of the canyon. It does not appear on any surveyor's map I have ever seen because it is old. Very old. It follows the creek bed before the creek was redirected by the mining company 3 years back. I have used it twice. Once in October and once in early spring when the north route was washed out." Jeremiah was silent for a long moment, studying her with those dark eyes that never seemed to miss anything. And in that silence, she watched something shift in his face, the slow, almost reluctant replacement of skepticism with a different kind of attention. The kind that a man pays when he realizes he might be wrong. "Show me," he said quietly. And that was the beginning of everything, though neither of them knew it yet. 3 weeks earlier, Ida Fairchild had arrived in the mining settlement of Copper Creek, Colorado Territory, on a gray Tuesday morning in November of 1879. Her bay horse picking careful steps through the mud-slick Main Street, while she cataloged the town with the same clinical efficiency she applied to everything. 2 saloons, 1 general store, a sheriff's office that looked like it had survived several violent altercations and been only partially repaired after each one, a church that needed paint, and a scattering of homes that told the story of a town deciding whether it wanted to survive or give up. She had been 3 years in the Colorado Territory, working as a healer and herbalist out of whatever town needed her most, never staying long enough in any one place to put down roots. She had her reasons. Rooting meant trusting, and trusting had cost her things she would not speak of out loud. She had trained under Dr. Emmett Fairchild, her father by adoption, no blood between them, a man who had pulled her off the street in St. Louis when she was 16 and half-starved, and seen something in her that she had not yet seen in herself. He had taught her everything he knew about frontier medicine over the course of 6 years, and when he died of pneumonia in the winter of 1876, she had buried him with her own hands, wept alone for 3 days, and then picked up his medical bag and kept going. Because that was what he would have wanted, and also because healing was the one thing in the world she was absolutely certain she was meant to do. She knew plants. She knew them the way some people know the faces of their family instinctively, deeply, without having to think about it. She knew which bark to strip and boil for fever, which root to grind for infection, which leaves to dry and steep for pain. She knew the chemistry behind the remedies, because Dr. Fairchild had insisted on that. A healer who only knows the recipe but not the reason behind it is a cook, not a physician, he had told her once, and she had taken that to heart completely. She had also, in her 3 years of roaming, developed a comprehensive knowledge of every trail, creek bed, canyon route, and mountain path in a 200-mile radius, because getting to a patient fast often mattered more than anything else in her bag. Copper Creek had written to the settlement of Durango, requesting a healer 6 weeks ago. The letter had made its way to Ida through the informal network of frontier communication, a combination of postal riders, general store gossip, and word of mouth at church meetings, and she had packed her horse and pointed herself north. She was not expecting the man who met her at the edge of town. He was leading a big roan horse, and he stopped dead in the middle of the street when he saw her coming, and his expression went through 3 distinct phases in about 4 seconds. The first was expectation, the square set of someone waiting for a thing they had arranged. The second was surprise, sharp and immediate. The third was a careful blankness that she recognized as a man trying to recover his composure. "You are the healer from Durango," he said. "I am the healer, yes," she said. "Ida Fairchild. You are the man who sent the letter." "Jeremiah Watkins," he said. "I am the county sheriff." He said it in a way that was not quite defensive but contained the faint shadow of a man who expected his title to carry considerable weight. "I was expecting someone older." "Most people were expecting someone who was not a woman," she said pleasantly. "I find it is better to simply arrive and let my work speak." She watched his jaw tighten and then, slowly, release. He had good self-control, she noted. She had met men whose faces she could read like text on a page, and Jeremiah Watkins had that quality, everything written there, but with the discipline to pause before letting it spill into action. "Fair enough," he said finally. "Come on, then. There are 4 people who need seeing." He was not wrong about that. The next 4 hours were spent in a steady procession of frontier ailments. A broken arm that had been badly set and needed to be rebroken and set correctly, which Ida did with quiet efficiency while Jeremiah held the patient's shoulders and kept his eyes on her rather than on the blood. A case of the croup in a toddler that she treated with a steam tent, and a preparation of wild cherry bark and honey. A laceration on a miner's thigh that needed cleaning and stitching. And an elderly woman named Mrs. Gunderson whose heart was struggling in the cold, and who needed rest, warmth, and a preparation of hawthorn berry tea that Ida promised to make fresh every morning. By the time evening came, she was weary in her bones but satisfied in her soul, which was the particular combination that told her she was doing what she was meant to do. She had taken a room at the boarding house operated by a widow named Mrs. Calloway, a round-faced woman with sharp eyes and a kind manner who fed Ida hot beef stew and cornbread, and did not ask too many questions, which Ida appreciated more than she could say. She did not expect Jeremiah Watkins to knock on the boarding house door at 7:30 in the evening. "I wanted to apologize," he said when she opened it. He held his hat in his hands, which she had already learned was the physical equivalent of lowering a flag. "For what I said this morning, about expecting someone older." She looked at him for a moment. He was the kind of man who took up space without seeming to notice it, not aggressively, but simply through the sheer physical fact of his existence. Wide shoulders under a heavy canvas coat, hands that looked like they had done serious work for a long time, a jaw that had a scar running along its left side, old and faded now, the kind of scar that told a story it was not immediately sharing. "You do not need to apologize for an honest reaction," she said. "I do when the honest reaction is also a rude one," he said. She almost smiled. "Come in then, Mrs. Calloway made enough stew for a small army, and I cannot finish it alone." That was how they began, not with romance, nothing so clean or simple as that, but with stew and a conversation that lasted 2 hours and covered more ground than Ida had expected. He told her about Copper Creek, about the mining operations and the violence that followed money, and the difficult balance of enforcing law in a territory where the law was still something of a suggestion. She told him about her training, about the plants and the remedies, about the trails she had ridden. She did not tell him about her dark past, about the man Incent. Louis, who had tried to claim ownership of her skills and her person, and whom she had escaped by taking only what she could carry and not looking back. She did not tell him that she had learned to keep herself moving partly because movement made her feel safe in a way that stillness never did. He did not tell her, she would learn later, about the grief he carried like a stone in his chest, the wife he had lost to a difficult birth 3 years ago, the child who had not survived either, the particular silence that had settled into his house afterward like a permanent winter. What they did that first evening was talk carefully around the edges of their respective hidden things, and find in the space between them a cautious, genuine interest that neither of them had planned on or particularly wanted. Over the following 2 weeks, a pattern established itself. Jeremiah would appear at the boarding house or at the small room Mrs. Calloway had given over for Ida's use as a clinic, and he would stay longer than any official business required. He watched her work with an attention that was different from the way most men watched her, not assessing whether she was adequate, but genuinely observing, genuinely curious about what she knew and how she knew it. One afternoon he found her in the alley behind the general store, crouched in the mud examining a plant that had grown up through the boards of the old fence. "What is that?" he asked, crouching beside her. "Yarrow," she said. "Late in the season, but the cold has preserved it. It is useful for stopping bleeding." She glanced at him. "Also for fever and for digestive trouble, though it is most famous for wounds." She carefully clipped several stems and placed them in the oilskin pouch she carried for that purpose. "How do you know all of this?" he asked, not skeptical, genuinely wanting to understand. "Years of study and practice," she said. "Dr. Fairchild taught me the foundation. But I have spent 3 years walking this territory and learning what grows where and what it does. The land tells you things if you pay attention." He was quiet for a moment, watching her hands move through the dead leaves at the base of the fence looking for more. "You are not afraid of this country," he observed. "No," she said. "The country is honest. It does not pretend to be anything it is not." She paused. "People are the only things that frighten me." She felt him looking at the side of her face, and she kept her eyes on the ground, but she was very aware of the warmth of him in the cold air. "That is the loneliest thing I have ever heard someone say," he said quietly. She picked up another sprig of yarrow and stood, brushing the mud from her skirt. "It is simply true," she said. "Most true things are lonely." She walked back toward the clinic and he walked with her, and neither of them said anything for a while, but the silence between them had changed quality. It was no longer the careful neutral space of two strangers. It had become something more specific, more charged, like air before lightning. The Henderson family arrived in Copper Creek on a Wednesday, 6 days before the blizzard. Thomas Henderson was a farmer trying to move his family. His wife Clara, their 8-year-old son Will, and their 5-year-old daughter Nora, from their failing homestead in the eastern plain to a cousin's established farm on the far side of the mountains. He had arrived with a wagon that had seen better decades and a plan that depended entirely on the weather cooperating. The weather, as was its habit in Colorado in November, did not cooperate. Clara Henderson came to Ida's clinic on Thursday with a worried face and a worse-looking child. Nora had developed a fever 2 days into the journey, and now she was flushed and glassy-eyed in a way that made the back of Ida's neck prickle with professional alarm. "How long has she been like this?" Ida asked, her hands already moving over the child, checking her pulse at the wrist, pressing gently on the glands at her neck, looking at her throat. "4 days," Clara said, her voice tight with the particular fear of a mother who has been trying to be calm for too long. "I thought it would break on its own." "It should have," Ida said, thinking out loud. She kept her face neutral because a healer who looked frightened communicated fear to the patient and to the patient's family, and fear was one of the things that made bodies worse. I want you to stay here tonight. I'm going to treat her fever and watch her. She was preparing a preparation of white willow bark and elderberry when Jeremiah appeared at the clinic door. He took one look at the child on the examination table, and then at Ida's face, and she watched him correctly interpret what he saw there. "What do you need?" he asked without preamble or qualification. She had handed him a list without thinking. Another blanket, clean water kept warm on the stove, and if he could find birch bark from the stand of trees at the creek edge before nightfall, she would be grateful. He had been back with all three things in under an hour, and she had not been surprised, which told her something about the assumptions she had already formed about him. Nora Henderson's fever came down by morning but did not break entirely, and Ida made the decision that the child needed to get to a proper settlement physician as quickly as possible. The nearest one was over the mountains, in the town of Silver Falls on the western side, a doctor named Pierce who had trained in Philadelphia and who Ida had coordinated with twice by letter. She told Thomas Henderson this directly. "We were heading that way regardless," Thomas said. "We can go now if you think it is urgent." "I think going before the weather turns is wise," Ida said. She looked out the window at the sky, which had the particular gray-white quality of a sky with serious intentions. "Though I will tell you honestly, I do not love the look of that horizon." It was Jeremiah who came to her that evening with his face set in an expression she could not quite read. "I am going to ride with them," he said. She blinked. "The Hendersons. The pass is a full day's ride and the weather is uncertain. Thomas Henderson has never ridden these mountains. That child needs to get to Pierce, and she needs to get there without her father driving the wagon off a switchback because he does not know the trail." She had looked at him for a long moment, this man who was choosing to take a day and a half out of his work and his life to guide a farming family safely over a mountain because a little girl was sick. Something in her chest moved, an old, guarded thing that she had learned to keep very still. "I am coming with you," she said. "Ida." "She is my patient," Ida said, in a tone that closed the subject. "And if she takes a turn on that trail, you will want someone there who knows what to do." He looked at her for a long moment, and she could see him weighing it, not whether she was capable, she noted, but whether it was safe. And then he nodded. "Be ready at first light," he said. She was ready an hour before first light, which she knew would annoy him and which she permitted herself to enjoy slightly. The first several hours of the ride were uneventful and almost beautiful, the kind of Colorado mountain morning that made the difficulty of frontier life feel temporarily worth it. The trail climbed through pine and aspen, frost-silvered and silent, and Ida rode beside the wagon while Jeremiah scouted ahead, and little Nora lay bundled in the wagon bed being attended to by her mother with the careful dedication of a woman who had decided that fear was not an option. Will Henderson, the 8-year-old son, appointed himself the family's official optimist and chattered cheerfully from the wagon seat beside his father, pointing out elk tracks and asking Jeremiah detailed questions about the mechanics of being a sheriff, which Jeremiah answered with a patience and specificity that Ida found unexpectedly touching. She found herself watching him more than the trail, which was a dangerous thing to notice about herself. The sky changed at midday. It changed the way serious things change, all at once, definitively, without any of the gradual warning that would have allowed for a comfortable response. The gray-white deepened to a flat, heavy white that seemed to press down from above, and the temperature dropped 10 degrees in the span of a quarter hour, and then the snow began. It began gently. It was never gentle. Ida thought snow that began gently in the high mountains was simply snow that had not yet committed to its true purpose. By the time they reached the upper approach to Ridgecrest Pass, commitment had been fully made. The wind hit them like a physical wall, driving snow horizontally into their faces, and the visibility collapsed to almost nothing. Jeremiah pulled back to ride beside the wagon, his big roan horse sidestepping against the wind with the agitation of an animal that understood danger. "We need to find shelter," he said, pitching his voice over the wind. His eyes found Ida's. "The pass is another quarter-mile," she said. "If we can get through it." The sound came before any of them could finish a thought. A deep, grinding roar from somewhere above them. The sound of the mountains shifting in the way mountains shift when they are done tolerating whatever has been balanced on them. Jeremiah pulled his horse sharply left, and Ida pulled hers right, and the wagon horses screamed, and lunged, and Thomas Henderson held the reins with everything he had. And then the snow came down across the face of the pass in a wall so complete and so sudden that it seemed less like weather and more like a door being slammed. When the dust and snow settled, they stared at what had been the entrance to the pass. There was no entrance anymore. There was a mountain. That was when Jeremiah walked forward and pressed his hand against the packed snow and said what Ida already knew. The pass was sealed. There was no way through. He had ridden these mountains for 11 years, and there was one pass, and it was buried. And Ida had looked down the mountain, pulled out the map in her mind, the map she had been building for 3 years, trail by trail, step by step, every creek bed and deer path and old mining track and dried-up waterway, and she had found it. The lower trail. The one she had used twice before. The one that followed the original course of the creek before the Carver Mining Company had dammed and redirected the water in 1876 to serve their operations. The one that was not on any surveyor's map, because by the time the surveyors had come through, the creek was gone and the trail had been abandoned. The one she had found by accident the first time when her horse had gone lame near the South Canyon face, and she had walked out on foot and discovered that the old creek bed made a natural path through the rocks. "Show me," Jeremiah had said. She showed him. She led them down the mountain and then southwest along the canyon face, moving carefully because the footing was uncertain, and the visibility was poor, and the wind was punishing. She kept her hand on the south rock face as she moved, feeling the contours of it, letting her memory work in conjunction with her fingers. She had walked this in spring mud and October frost, but never in a blizzard, and the world looked entirely different through a curtain of driven snow. But her memory was not a visual one. It was a physical memory, the memory of her feet and her hands, of angles and slopes, and the particular way the rock changed texture where the old creek had carved it smooth. She had learned early in her healer's education that the body remembered things the conscious mind let go of, and she trusted that now completely. Jeremiah rode close behind her, and she could feel his attention like a hand on her shoulder, steady, alert, not interfering. He had not questioned her again after that first moment. He had made a decision, and he was fully committed to it, which she understood instinctively was simply how this man operated. They moved for 2 hours through the blizzard, the wagon lurching and swaying on the uneven ground, the children inside silent now in the way children go silent when they understand that the adults around them are managing something very serious. Clara Henderson held Nora close and whispered things to her, and Thomas Henderson drove his horses with a grim focus that Ida respected enormously, because the man had no idea where he was going, and he was trusting 2 strangers completely, which required a particular quality of courage. There was a moment, about an hour in, when the trail seemed to disappear. Ida stopped, and she felt the whole small party stop behind her, and the wind screamed at them from the west, and the snow came in sheets so thick they were almost tangible, and she stood with her hand on the rock face and her eyes closed, and she breathed. She heard Jeremiah dismount. He was beside her in seconds, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him even through the cold. "Ida," he said quietly, just her name, not a question, not a command, just her name, said in a way that communicated something she did not immediately have words for. "I know where I am," she said. Her hand moved along the rock, searching. There, a change in the texture, the smooth water-carved stone giving way to rougher granite, and that transition was the landmark. It meant the trail angled sharply right here, into a narrow cut between 2 boulders that did not look like anything from outside but opened into the lower canyon path. "There," she said, and she led them through. Jeremiah was very quiet for a long time after that. She could feel him thinking behind her. An hour later, the trail widened, and the canyon walls gave them shelter from the worst of the wind. And through the lessening snow, Ida saw the first pine trees of the lower valley and knew they were going to make it. The particular loosening in her chest that came with knowing they were safe, that was a feeling she recognized, a healer's relief, the release of a tension she had been holding since the avalanche had come down. "There," she said, pointing to a dark line of trees. "The valley floor. From there it is a straight ride south to Silver Falls." She heard Thomas Henderson make a sound that was not quite a word, a raw, choked sound, the sound of a man who has been holding his family together by sheer will, and has just been given permission to let go slightly. Clara's voice came from inside the wagon, high and questioning, and Thomas said, "We are through, Clara. We are through," and his voice broke on the last word. Jeremiah appeared at her shoulder. He was on foot, having dismounted some time ago to lead the horses through the narrow cut, and now he stood beside her in the diminishing snow and looked out at the valley below, and then he looked at her. His expression was something she had not seen before on his face. The careful, controlled blankness was entirely gone. What was there instead was something unguarded and enormous, the look of a man who has had a fundamental assumption about the world revised and has not yet worked out how to fold the revision back into his understanding. "You found it," he said, "by memory, in a blizzard." "I told you I knew another way," she said. "You did," he said. He kept looking at her. "I underestimated you." She had expected the words to feel sharp, as they usually did when men said them, because there was generally a self-congratulatory note underneath, a patting of oneself on the back for finally acknowledging what should never have been questioned. But Jeremiah said it differently. He said it with the plain honesty of a man making an accounting of a mistake, without excuse or ornamentation. "Yes," she said, "you did. I am sorry for that," he said. "I am genuinely sorry." She looked at him then, really looked at him, and she saw the sincerity, and it was a physical thing, as real and dense as the snow around them, and something she had been keeping very carefully behind a wall that she had built over years of disappointing encounters with people who doubted her capabilities. Something behind that wall moved toward the light. "Help me get the wagon down this last slope," she said, "and we will call it even." He almost smiled. It was not quite a smile, but it occupied the space where one was forming. "Yes, ma'am," he said. Getting the wagon down the last slope to the valley floor was a considerable effort involving 4 ropes, every human hand, and a great deal of creative cooperation between Jeremiah and Thomas Henderson that resulted in both men covered in snow, and one of the ropes breaking at a critical moment, and Jeremiah catching the back of the wagon by brute strength, while Ida and Clara hauled from the front, and the horses made their feelings about the entire situation very loud and very clear. When the wagon finally rolled onto the flat ground of the valley floor, all 5 adults sat down in the snow without having mutually agreed to do so, and did nothing for about 3 minutes except breathe. Then Nora Henderson, who had been alarmingly quiet throughout the ordeal, said from inside the wagon in a small, clear voice, "Are we not moving any more?" "We are in the valley, sweetheart," Clara said, and she was laughing now, the specific kind of laughing that was very close to its emotional neighbor on the other side. "Is Dr. Fairchild still here?" Nora asked. "I am right here," Ida said, and she climbed back up to check on the child. The fever was still there, not broken, but the child's eyes were clearer than they had been an hour ago, or perhaps that was simply relief giving Ida an optimistic eye. She checked the pulse steady, if elevated. She gave Nora a sip of the willow bark preparation she had kept warm inside the wrapped bottles in her bag, and the child drank it without protest, which was itself a good sign. Silver Falls was 4 hours south even in good weather. With an ill child and a damaged wagon, Ida estimated 6, and she told Thomas Henderson so. He nodded and climbed back to the driver's seat, and they went. Jeremiah rode beside Ida for a while without speaking, and the snow had softened to a gentle drift now that they were in the sheltered valley. And the silence between them was of a completely different character from any silence they had shared before. It was the silence of two people who have been through something difficult together and have come out the other side of it with a new understanding of one another. "Where did you learn the trails?" he asked eventually. "By walking them," she said. "Every trail I ride I catalog. Landmarks, distances, elevations, connections to other trails. When I first came to this territory, I realized quickly that the land here was not well mapped and that getting to patients quickly depended on knowing routes that other people did not know." She paused. "I have notebooks, 47 of them now. Each one covers a section of the territory." 47 notebooks, he repeated. "I am thorough," she said. He was quiet for a moment. "I have been sheriff here for 4 years," he said, "and I have relied on basically 3 trails and my own general sense of direction." "That explains why it took you so long to find the Benson brothers last summer," she said. He turned to look at her sharply. "How do you know about the Benson brothers?" "Mrs. Calloway is very well informed about everything that happens in this county," Ida said, "and she talks while she cooks. It is a useful quality." He made a sound that was definitively a laugh this time, short and surprised and genuine, and it changed his face completely in a way that did something uncomfortable and wonderful to her carefully maintained composure. They arrived in Silver Falls as the last of the daylight was bleeding out of the sky, and Dr. Pierce met them at the door of his office as though he had been expecting them, which he had not, but which was the quality of a good physician, always ready, always moving before the thought was complete. He took Nora Henderson inside immediately, and Ida followed to give him her assessment and the treatment she had already begun, and they spoke in the clipped shorthand of 2 medical professionals sharing a case, and she felt Pierce's respect in the focused way he listened, which was the best form of respect because it was entirely professional and contained no condescension. Thomas and Clara Henderson. Once Nora was settled and Pierce had given his preliminary assessment, the same infection Ida had suspected. Treatable, with rest and proper medication the child would be fine once that had been communicated. Thomas Henderson shook Jeremiah's hand for so long that it became awkward, and then he turned to Ida, and his face was a thing that she would carry with her for a long time. Raw gratitude, the kind that has no performance in it because the emotion is too big for any kind of pretense. "You saved my daughter," he said. "That trail, your daughter saved herself," Ida said firmly. "She is a strong child." "I simply helped her body do what it was already trying to do." She smiled at him, and it was a real smile, unguarded. "You should all rest tonight. Dr. Pierce will take good care of Nora." She found a room at the Silver Falls Hotel, a modest establishment that nevertheless had the great luxury of a properly functioning wood stove, and she sat beside it for a long time after she had eaten and washed, letting the warmth work its way into bones that had been cold for more hours than she liked to count. There was a knock at her door at 9:30. She opened it. Jeremiah stood in the hallway with his hat in his hands, and she was developing a very specific response to that posture that she was trying to be sensible about. "I wanted to make sure you were all right," he said. "I am warm and fed and not dead," she said. "I am excellent." The corner of his mouth moved. "Can I talk to you for a moment?" She opened the door wider and he came in, and she pulled the second chair close to the stove and they sat across from each other in the warmth, and the fire snapped between them, and outside the window Silver Falls was quiet under its new coat of snow. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you did today, on the mountain. You do not have to." "Let me finish," he said, and it was not unkind but it was direct. She closed her mouth. "I have been thinking about how I have treated you since you arrived in Copper Creek. I told myself I was simply being careful, that I did not know your capabilities yet, that it was reasonable to withhold judgment until I had seen your work." He paused. "But today I realize that is not entirely true. The truth is that I made assumptions before you ever demonstrated anything. And those assumptions were based on nothing that had anything to do with you specifically." She watched him carefully. He was not comfortable with this speech. It was costing him something to give it. That made it more meaningful, not less. "I know what it is like," he said, looking at his hands for a moment, "to have people make assumptions about what you are capable of, or what you deserve." He looked up. "My wife Ruth, people made assumptions about her too, about what a woman could handle, what she needed to be protected from, what decisions she had the right to make." His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it, that old grief, the stone in his chest. She died because a doctor in Denver decided that what she needed was rest and prayer instead of the surgery that might have saved her. He made that decision without asking her, without asking me. He decided she was too fragile to survive the operation. He stopped. "She was not fragile, she was the strongest person I have ever known." The fire crackled. Ida sat very still. "I am sorry," she said, "for Ruth," and she meant it with everything she had. "I am sorry I did not extend to you from the beginning the respect your skill has earned," he said. "I should have." She looked at him for a long time, this man with his scar and his grief and his hat in his hands and his willingness to sit in his own discomfort and examine it honestly. She thought about her own secrets, her own dark past, the things she carried that she had never trusted anyone enough to put down. "The man I worked for before I came to the Colorado Territory," she said, before she had fully decided to say it, "was not a man who had any interest in my capabilities except as they served his purposes. He had a medical practice in St. Louis, and he recognized early that I was skilled, so he made me his assistant, but he never called me that. He told patients I was the cleaning woman and had me work in the back room, and he took credit for my diagnoses and my treatments." She felt the old anger of it, clean and pure now, less sharp than it once was but still there. "When I told him I wanted to take a case on my own, he told me that was not possible. When I told him I was leaving, he told me I was his property, that he had trained me and he owned my knowledge." She paused. "I left anyway, at night, with only what I could carry." Jeremiah said nothing, but his hands had tightened on his hat. "So when I say I am not afraid of the country," she said, "but I am afraid of people, that is where that comes from." She met his eyes. "I have been moving since because it felt safer, because trust has a cost and I have paid it before." "I understand that," he said quietly, "better than most." "I know you do," she said. They sat in the warmth of the stove for another hour, not always talking, but the silence between them was completely different now. It had become a shared thing, a space that belonged to both of them, and Ida felt something she had not felt in a very long time, the particular ease of being known, of having told someone a true thing about herself and not having them step back. He left at midnight with a good night that was simple and honest, and she sat alone in the firelight for a while afterward and acknowledged to herself, without drama or ceremony, that she was in considerable trouble. She was in trouble because Jeremiah Watkins was exactly the kind of person it was dangerous to trust, the kind who made it feel reasonable, who made it feel like the natural direction of things, who made her old careful walls feel less like protection and more like a prison she had forgotten she was in. She slept badly but was not unhappy about it. They rode back to Copper Creek the next morning, with the blizzard behind them and the sky a pure and brilliant blue above snow-covered mountains that looked entirely different from the inside of a disaster than they did from the outside of one, peaceful, magnificent, indifferent in the way that only beautiful things can be indifferent. The trail they took back was the north route, since Jeremiah sent a message ahead, and the citizens of Copper Creek organized a shoveling party that cleared enough of the pass by the following morning to allow passage. They rode side by side for most of it, which was not strictly necessary, and which neither of them commented on. He told her about his 11 years in the territory, about arriving from Ohio when he was 25 with nothing but a horse and a commitment to not doing things halfway, about the early years of the mining boom when Copper Creek had been genuinely dangerous in a way that it had moved past now, about learning the land the way he had by riding it over and over until it became something he understood without having to think about. She told him about her 47 notebooks, showed him the one she carried in her medical bag, the current volume, filled with her neat, precise handwriting and hand-drawn maps of every trail in the region, annotated with notes about seasonal conditions, water sources, plant life, potential shelter locations. He asked to look at it, and she handed it to him and watched his face as he went through it. The shock on his face when he realized the depth and precision of what she had compiled was something she stored away with considerable satisfaction. "This is extraordinary," he said. He was not flattering her. He was simply reporting what he was seeing. "It is thorough," she said, which was what she always said when someone expressed surprise at the extent of her work, because it was the most accurate description. "Ida," he stopped and looked at her, the notebook still open in his hands. "This is a survey, a real survey, more detailed than anything the government has produced for this county. Do you know what this would be worth to people trying to navigate this territory? It is worth getting to patients on time," she said. "That is what it is for." He looked at her for another moment, and she recognized the expression now. It was the one he had worn on the mountain when she had led them through the blizzard. Deeply impressed, revised, recalibrated. "Yes," he said. "Of course it is." He handed it back carefully, with both hands, as though it were something valuable, which it was. December arrived in Copper Creek with a cold that was gentler than November had threatened, but persistent in the way that cold is persistent when it has decided to stay. Ida settled into a rhythm she had not felt in years, the rhythm of a place that was becoming familiar, a people who were becoming her people, a work that had enough variety and enough challenge to keep her fully engaged. She delivered a baby in the first week of December, a healthy boy born to the Sorensen family who lived in a homestead east of town, and she stayed the night to make sure mother and child were stable. And when she rode back in the early morning, the town was still and snow-covered, and she felt something she identified very clearly as happiness, which she had learned to notice carefully because it was a more complicated feeling than it appeared. Jeremiah met her at the edge of town, which she was no longer surprised by. He fell in with her horse, and they rode the last quarter-mile together in the early morning silence. "How are they?" he asked. "Both well," she said. "Mathilda Sorensen is stronger than she looks, and the baby is enormous," Tor Sorensen cried. "Men cry at births," Jeremiah said, without any defensiveness or dismissal, simply stating a thing he found unremarkable. "They do," she said, glancing at him. "You would know." Something crossed his face, the memory of Ruth she knew and the child they had lost. She reached out and put her hand briefly on his arm through the heavy wool of his coat, and she felt him breathe. "Yes," he said, "I would know." She did not remove her hand immediately. She left it there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, and he did not move away, and that was how they stayed for a few seconds while the horses walked and the town was quiet around them. She was developing a very serious problem with this man. The problem came to a head on a Saturday evening in the middle of December, when Mrs. Calloway hosted what she called a holiday gathering, and which was essentially the entire town crammed into her parlor with mulled cider and dried apple pie and a great deal of goodwill. Ida had not intended to stay long. She had patients to check on, and notes to write, and the comfortable routine of her solitary evenings. She stayed 3 hours. She stayed because of the way Jeremiah Watkins looked at her across a crowded room when he thought she was not looking. She caught him twice, and both times his expression had the quality of a man who was engaged in a private debate with himself, and losing ground on the side that was arguing for caution. She helped Mrs. Calloway clear dishes in the kitchen at the end of the evening, and she was standing at the kitchen basin when she heard him come in behind her. "You should go home," she said without turning around. "You have an early patrol tomorrow." "I know," he said. He did not go home. He came to stand beside her at the basin and picked up a cloth and started drying the dishes she was washing, which was a completely ordinary domestic thing, and which made her heart do something inconvenient. "Ida," he said. "Jeremiah," she said, "I have something I want to say to you, and I am not entirely certain how to say it without making things considerably more complicated." She kept her hands in the wash water. Then perhaps you should simply say it plainly and let the complication sort itself out. He set down the dish he was drying. He turned to face her fully, and she turned to face him, her hands dripping, and they stood in Mrs. Calloway's kitchen with the sounds of the remaining guests fading in the parlor beyond, and he looked at her with that direct, unguarded honesty that she had learned was simply the way he was and which she had stopped being able to defend against. "I would like to court you," he said, "if you are amenable to that." She held his gaze. "That is a very formal thing to say." "I am a formal person when the stakes are high," he said. "Yes," she said. "I have noticed that." She took a breath. "I am not easy to know, Jeremiah. I have a dark past that I do not talk about freely, and habits that come from being alone for a long time, and a tendency to value my own judgment over other people's considerably more than is perhaps comfortable to live alongside." "I know," he said. "I have been paying attention. And you are still standing in this kitchen." "I am still standing in this kitchen," he said. She dried her hands on her apron and looked at him for a long moment. This man who had ridden into a blizzard without hesitation to help a family he barely knew, who had sat on the floor of his office with Will Henderson discussing the mechanics of frontier law enforcement with complete seriousness, who had apologized for his own mistakes without qualification, who had carried his grief for 3 years without letting it make him bitter or closed or incapable of looking at the world with clear eyes. "Yes," she said, "I am amenable to that." The change in his face was something she knew she would remember for the rest of her life. Courtship in Copper Creek in 1879 was a public thing by necessity, since a town of 300 people had very little in the way of privacy and an enormous amount of interest in its own social developments. Within a week, everyone knew that the sheriff was calling on the healer, and the collective opinion of Copper Creek expressed itself in the form of an endless supply of baked goods left at Ida's clinic by various townspeople, which she distributed to patients and to the boarding house table, and which she received with the resigned grace of a woman who understood that she was part of a community now, and that communities had opinions, and expressed them through pastry. She let herself be courted and found that it was different from what she had expected, because what she had expected, based on her limited and not entirely positive previous experience, was a process of gradual narrowing, a man establishing his claim, testing the edges of her independence, deciding what parts of her were acceptable and what parts needed to be managed. What she found instead was a process of gradual expansion. Jeremiah was curious about her. Consistently, genuinely curious about her work, her knowledge, her notebooks, her opinions on everything from the territorial government to the best route between 2 settlements. He asked questions and listened to the answers and sometimes disagreed, and when he disagreed he said so directly and without cruelty, and when she provided a counterargument that he found convincing, he changed his position, which she had not experienced from a man before, and which she found entirely disarming. He rode with her to patients when he could, not to protect her. He had understood fairly quickly that she did not need that and did not want it, but because he was interested in what she did and found the combination of botanical knowledge and medical practice genuinely fascinating. She, in turn, began to understand the depth and seriousness of his work, the genuine difficulty of enforcing a law that was still being written in a territory where the history of that law had included extraordinary violence against people who had lived there long before the mining companies came. She heard him talk about the Ute people who had been displaced from the western slopes 3 years ago, and she heard in his voice something she recognized as guilt. Not a comfortable, managed guilt, but the real kind, the kind that sits in your chest and does not let you pretend you are not implicated in things larger than yourself. "I enforced the removal orders," he said, one afternoon as they rode together toward the Sorensen homestead for a follow-up on Mathilda and the baby. "I was given a direct order from the territorial government and I enforced it. I told myself I had no choice." "Did you?" she asked. I had less choice than I wanted and more than I used, he said. That is the honest answer. She was quiet for a moment. I think that is probably the honest answer for most of the things this country has done, she said. The question is what we do with the knowing of it. He looked at her sidelong. What would you do with it? I would refuse the next order I disagreed with, she said, and the one after that. And I would take care of every Ute person who came to my clinic regardless of what anyone else thought about it, which I already do. He was quiet. I know, he said. I have seen you do it. And have you had anything to say about it? She asked, watching him. I have defended it when people have complained, he said, loudly enough that they stopped complaining. She felt the warmth of that knowledge move through her. Good, she said simply. Christmas came and passed in the way it did on the frontier, with less ceremony than it deserved, and more genuine feeling than expected. Ida gave Jeremiah one of her trail notebooks, a copy she had made specifically for him, covering the trails of the Copper Creek County with enough detail that he would never again have to rely on 3 routes and a sense of direction. She had spent 3 evenings on it, and he knew it, and he looked at it for a long time before he looked at her. You made this for me, he said. I made it for your county, she said, and for anyone who might need to get somewhere fast on a mountain. He gave her a copy of a botanical reference book he had ordered from a publisher in Philadelphia 3 weeks ago, and which had arrived only 2 days before Christmas, and she opened it and ran her hands over the pages with the particular reverence that a person who truly loves books reserves for a new one. How did you know I did not have this edition? She asked. I asked you what references you relied on, he said, and catalogued what you mentioned. She looked up. You catalogued it. I pay attention, he said. She stood on her toes and kissed him, which she had not done before and which surprised them both, and then she did not step back, and he reached up and put his hand along the side of her face with a gentleness that was entirely at odds with the size and calloused roughness of his hand, and they stood in the warmth of Mrs. Calloway's parlor, while snow fell outside and the fire burned steady. January was cold, and January was quiet, and January was the month that Ida stopped running. She did not announce this decision. She simply noticed, one morning in the 2nd week of January, that she had not thought about moving on in almost 3 weeks, which was longer than she had gone without thinking about it since she was 16 years old. She noticed this and sat with it for a while, examining it from different angles the way she examined an unfamiliar plant, looking for the thorns, the poisonous parts, the places where it could hurt her. She did not find them. She found, instead, something she had not expected to find in Copper Creek, Colorado territory, the feeling of being home. She was in her clinic when Jeremiah came in on a Tuesday afternoon, with a face that told her immediately that he had something to say, and that he had been thinking about how to say it for longer than was comfortable. He sat in the patient chair and turned his hat in his hands, and she put down the preparation she was working on and gave him her full attention. I have been trying to find the right moment for this for 3 weeks, he said. There are no right moments, she said. There is only the moment you are in. He looked at her. I love you, Ida, he said. He said it the way he said most important things, directly, without softening or ornamentation, simply and completely. I am telling you this because you deserve to know it and because I believe in honesty between people who matter to each other. I am not asking you for anything in return. He stopped. I needed to say it. She had been preparing a response since she saw him come in the door. She had a carefully assembled, sensible speech about the value of honesty and her own complicated feelings and the importance of moving thoughtfully. Every word of it evaporated. I love you too, she said. I have been trying not to for about 6 weeks, and I have been entirely unsuccessful. He was across the room and she was in his arms before she had finished the sentence, and he held her with the same focused, complete attention he gave to everything. And she pressed her face against the warmth of his chest and let herself be held, which was something she had not let herself do in a very long time and which felt terrifyingly, wonderfully like exactly the right thing. He proposed in March. He did it properly, which meant he told her first that he was going to ask her something and wanted her to know she could say no without it changing anything between them. And she had told him that she appreciated that greatly and then said yes before he had quite finished the question. And his laughter had been so unguarded and startled and genuine that she kept the sound of it in her memory like a pressed flower. They were married in April by the Reverend of the Copper Creek Church, in a ceremony attended by what appeared to be the entire town, including Thomas Henderson, who had brought Clara and the children across the mountains to attend as soon as the spring weather made the pass safe. Nora Henderson, fully recovered and demonstrably thriving, sat in the front pew beside her brother and held a small bouquet of wildflowers she had picked herself. She had asked Ida 3 separate times in the weeks leading up to the wedding whether she would still come to see them when they were sick, and Ida had told her 3 separate times that yes, she absolutely would, and a healer's promise was not something that changed based on personal circumstances. The ceremony was simple, and the celebration afterward was not, because Copper Creek had been holding its collective enthusiasm for months, and Mrs. Calloway had been baking since Thursday, and the result was a table of food that represented every culinary tradition in a 300-person mining town, which was a considerable variety. Jeremiah danced with Ida 3 times, and she suspected he would have danced with her more, but he kept being pulled away by various citizens who needed to congratulate him at length and with great personal detail. She watched him across the room, moving through the crowd, stopping to listen seriously to whatever each person needed to say, and she felt the full, uncomplicated warmth of loving someone in a context where the love made complete sense. He found her at the edge of the dancing beside the window, and he leaned down to speak close to her ear because the fiddle player was enthusiastic. "Would you like to go home?" he said. "Yes," she said, "very much." Home was the house she had moved into with him 3 weeks ago, a 2-story building on the eastern edge of Copper Creek that had more room than either of them had been using separately, and that she had been quietly transforming with the addition of bookshelves and herb drying racks and a second work table in the kitchen for preparing medications. He had not commented on the herb drying racks. He had built her another one. She had not commented on the fact that he had begun mapping the routes she described in her notebooks into a proper survey of the county, that he was planning to submit to the territorial government, with a full annotation of credit to Ida Fairchild Watkins as the primary surveyor. She had found out about it from Mrs. Calloway and had stood in the kitchen for a moment processing the enormity of what he was doing, not taking her work, not using it without acknowledgement, not deciding that because they were married it had become his, and then she had gone to find him. She found him at his desk in the office with the notebooks and a proper surveyor's map spread across every surface, making careful measurements and annotations. She stood in the doorway for a moment. He looked up. "You were not supposed to know about this yet," he said. "Mrs. Calloway," she said. "I should have anticipated that," he said. He looked at her carefully. "Is it all right?" "It is more than all right," she said. "It is," she stopped because she was unexpectedly not in control of her voice. "It is the most generous thing anyone has done for me." He stood up and came to her, and she let him pull her in, and he said quietly into her hair, "Your work matters. It should be seen. It should be credited. That is not generosity. That is simply correct." She held on to him for a long moment, this man who understood without having to be taught that her intelligence and her capabilities were not diminishments of him, but simply facts of the world, as real and worthy of respect as mountains. The summer of 1880 was a good summer. Ida's practice grew, and the formal recognition of her survey work, the territorial government had accepted Jeremiah's submission and had actually commissioned a follow-up, paying Ida directly, which had prompted a fascinating conversation with the territorial representative, who had clearly not been expecting the primary surveyor to be a woman, and who had required a moment of recalibration, brought her a professional standing in the territory that gave her access to resources and connections she had not had before. She hired an assistant, a young woman of 22 named Rosalind Green, who had basic medical training and was eager to learn more, and Ida taught her the way Dr. Fairchild had taught Ida with patience and rigor, and the constant insistence that understanding the reason behind every remedy was not optional. She and Jeremiah had their disagreements over his tendency to occasionally underestimate certain risks that she, as a medical professional, found alarming, over her tendency to work past the point of physical sense and need to be gently but firmly redirected towards sleep, over the correct way to make coffee, which was a smaller disagreement in theory than it turned out to be in practice. And they navigated these disagreements the way they had learned to navigate most things. Honestly, directly, without letting them accumulate into hidden resentments. "You have to tell me when something is wrong," she told him once, after they had spent 2 days circling a problem without naming it. "I cannot read your mind. I read plants, not people. I told you that from the beginning." "You read me," he said. "You always know." "I know the broad outlines," she said. "I need the specific words. Give me specific words." He gave her specific words from then on, and she gave him specific words, and it was not always comfortable, but it was always real, which was something she had not known was possible before, and which she valued beyond anything she could accurately express. She was pregnant by August. She discovered this with the specific combination of professional certainty and personal astonishment that she supposed was what happened when a medical practitioner encountered a condition in themselves that they had accurately diagnosed in dozens of other women. She sat in her clinic after Rosalind had gone home for the evening, and she held the knowledge quietly for a while, turning it over, examining it. She was not afraid. She had expected to be afraid. She knew what childbirth cost, had been in enough rooms where it had gone wrong to have a clear understanding of the risks, but fear was not what she felt. What she felt was something large and luminous and completely new. She went home and found Jeremiah at the kitchen table with the county records he reviewed every evening, and she sat down across from him and waited until he looked up. She watched the moment he read her face. She had not said a word. "Ida," he said, and his voice was careful with something enormous. "Yes," she said. He was around the table before she had completed the word, and he knelt in front of her chair and put his hands on her face. This man she loved, this man who had come out of his own grief to meet her in the particular middle of their lives, and she watched his face do something extraordinary. It became utterly transparent. Every layer of the controlled, composed sheriff completely dissolved, and what was underneath was pure and bright and entirely without reservation. "Are you all right?" he said. "Are you?" "I am perfectly well," she said. "I am the healer, Jeremiah. I know what to watch for." "I know you are the healer," he said. "I am asking how you feel." She took his hands from her face and held them in hers. "I feel as though something I did not know I was missing has arrived," she said. "I feel frightened in the most wonderful way I have ever been frightened." She pressed his hands. "How do you feel?" He turned her hands over in his and looked at them for a moment, these capable, knowledgeable hands that had led them through a blizzard and brought 100 people back from the edge of worse things. "Like the luckiest man in the Colorado Territory," he said. "Possibly in all of the United States." "That is a significant claim," she said. "I am prepared to defend it," he said, and he was smiling now, fully and completely, the smile that she had seen become more common over the past year and that she privately thought was one of the finest things she had ever had the privilege of looking at. Winter came again. They were not afraid of it. The baby was born in March of 1881, 2 days before the anniversary of their wedding, in the room upstairs with Rosalind in attendance and Dr. Pierce, who had made the trip over from Silver Falls because Ida had asked him, and because he took the request of a colleague seriously. Jeremiah was downstairs for most of the labor, being managed carefully by Mrs. Calloway, who appeared to have appointed herself the official keeper of Sheriff Watkins during the hours when the sheriff was not handling things with his characteristic composure. Ida was aware of this from a distance and found it deeply endearing. The boy arrived at just past 3 in the morning, loud and furious and absolutely present, in the way that new people are present completely, without apology, with total commitment to the fact of their own existence. "He is healthy," Rosalind said, and Ida heard the pure relief in her assistant's voice that a healer has when the thing she was afraid of did not happen. "He is healthy," Ida confirmed, from a position of both professional assessment and something entirely beyond professional assessment. She held him and felt the remarkable warm weight of him, and thought about all the trails she had walked, and all the notebooks she had filled and the blizzard on the mountain, and the moment she had turned away from a sealed pass and found another way. And she thought that all roads, if you followed them honestly, led somewhere worth going. Jeremiah came in and stopped in the doorway, and she looked at him across the room with the baby in her arms, and she watched him make the same three-phase journey his face made when anything very large happened to him. The shock, the processing, and then the arrival at something so deep and clear and real that the word she had for it was simply love. He came to her and sat beside her on the bed, and she put the baby in his arms, and he held him with the absolute focus of a man who has decided that this is the most important thing he has ever done. And the baby looked up at Jeremiah with the unfocused, serious gaze of a person who has just arrived somewhere and is taking preliminary inventory. "What are we calling him?" Jeremiah said. "I thought Emmett," she said, "if you agree." He looked at her. He knew about Dr. Fairchild, the adopted father who had made her who she was. "Emmett Watkins," he said. He nodded, and the nod was the kind that carries the full weight of a person's agreement. "Yes, that is exactly right." They named him Emmett James Watkins, the James for Jeremiah's father, and he grew up knowing that his mother's trail notebooks lined the shelf in the parlor alongside her botanical references and her medical texts, and that his father's name was on the county survey, but his mother's name was above it, and that this was simply how things were in a world that was gradually becoming more honest. In the spring of 1882, the territorial government formally appointed Ida as the county medical surveyor, a position that had not existed before, and that the territorial representative had invented specifically because there was no existing title that adequately covered what she did. Jeremiah attended the small ceremony with Emmett on his hip, and what Ida privately catalogued as the most satisfied expression she had ever seen on a human face. "You are insufferably pleased with yourself," she told him afterward. "I am pleased with you," he corrected. "There is a difference." She put her hand on his arm, there on the steps of the territorial office building in Denver, the city they had ridden to for the ceremony, with little Emmett between them being very serious about a biscuit and the spring sun on the mountains in every direction. "There is something I should tell you," she said. He looked at her sidelong. He read her face the way he had learned to read her face over 2 years of paying attention. "Ida," he said, "I will need you to be steady for the next several months," she said. "Not that you are not generally steady, but specifically steady." He was quiet for a moment. "How steady?" "Very steady," she said. "Building another shelf sort of steady." His face did the thing again, the three-phase thing. And then he laughed, startled and genuine and completely unguarded in the middle of the Denver street. And Emmett looked up at his father with great curiosity, and Ida looked at both of them, her family, the specific and irreplaceable family that had grown from a sealed mountain pass and a trail remembered by heart, and she felt the fullness of her life like a hand on her chest. Another child, another shelf. Another spring in Colorado with the mountains behind them and the whole of the territory laid out in her notebooks and in his survey, and in the knowledge they had made together, the knowledge of how to find a way through when the obvious path was blocked. You turned around. You looked for the lower trail. You trusted what your body remembered. You trusted the person beside you who had proven, over and over and over again, that the trust was not foolishness but the most intelligent thing you had ever done. Emmett's little sister arrived in October, born during a golden afternoon while the aspen trees were at their most spectacular, and the mountains wore their autumn colors like a final declaration before winter. They named her Clara, for the woman who had held her daughter through a blizzard and trusted a healer she barely knew. And Clara Watkins arrived into the world with her mother's dark eyes and her father's stubborn chin, and an immediate, imperious quality that suggested she had a great many opinions and planned to share them at the first available opportunity. Mrs. Calloway declared her the finest baby she had ever seen, which she had also declared about Emmett, which Jeremiah pointed out, and Mrs. Calloway told him that both things could be true, and why was he making things complicated? Rosalind Green delivered her first patient unassisted that same autumn, a straightforward birth at the Harper homestead that went well from beginning to end, and she rode back to Copper Creek the next morning with a face that Ida recognized because she had worn it herself, the face of someone who has done the thing they were meant to do and knows it. "You are ready to take your own practice," Ida told her. "I want to stay here," Rosalind said. "With you." "Then stay," Ida said. "This county is large enough for 2 healers and then some." The county surveyor's work expanded the following year into 2 neighboring counties, and Ida hired a young man named George Tennyson to assist with the cartographic work, a 24-year-old who had trained as a surveyor in St. Louis, and who was startled, she could see it clearly, to discover that his supervisor was a woman. She watched him process it with something like clinical interest, and gave him 3 weeks before she asked him directly whether he had adjusted his expectations. He had turned red. "Yes, ma'am," he said, "some weeks ago if I am honest." "Good," she said. "Honesty is the first qualification for this work." Jeremiah, who had been reading at his desk and pretending not to listen, said nothing, but she saw the line of his shoulders relax in a way that meant he was satisfied, which was something she had learned to read very precisely over 4 years. That evening he came home late from a long patrol, cold and tired, and she had kept supper warm and the stove burning high, and little Emmett was already asleep, and Clara was in her cradle in the corner of the sitting room being magnificently self-satisfied about some private achievement of babyhood. And Jeremiah sat down at the kitchen table and pulled off his boots and looked at her across the room with an expression that she had a word for now, a simple and complete word. "Long day," she said. "Long day," he confirmed. "You, productive," she said. "Tennyson is settling in. Rosalind delivered a healthy baby this morning without my involvement and came home looking like someone had given her the whole sky." "Good," he said. He reached out and she came to him, and he put his arms around her waist and she put her hand in his hair, and they stayed like that for a moment, the 2 of them, in the kitchen of their house with the children sleeping nearby, and the mountains outside the window standing exactly where they had always stood, patient and enormous and honest. "I have been thinking," he said into the warmth of her, "about next spring." "What about it?" "There is a section of the southern mountains we have not fully surveyed yet. The terrain past the old Carver mining track. I thought we might do it together, take the children, camp for a week." She thought about it. Emmett was 2.5 and would find a week of camping genuinely magnificent. Clara would be nearly 1 and would require careful management but was already demonstrating a resilient constitution. The southern section was a gap in her notebooks that had bothered her for 2 years. "Yes," she said. "I would like that very much." She felt him breathe. He held her a little closer. Outside the window, the Colorado winter was beginning to show its intentions again, the particular weight of the sky that she had learned, over 5 winters in this territory, to read like text on a page. She was not afraid of it. She knew another way through. She had always known another way through every sealed pass and every impossible blockage, and every moment when the obvious route was closed, and the world said no, and required her to go still and quiet and reach into the map in her mind, and find the path that was not on anyone else's survey. She had led a family through a blizzard on a trail remembered by heart. She had led herself, afterward, through the far more complicated terrain of trusting a person enough to let them matter. She had found in the middle of the Colorado mountains in the year 1879 The thing she had not known she was looking for: not safety, not stability, not the absence of risk, but a person who looked at everything she was, all of it. The intelligence and the capability and the dark past and the 47 notebooks and the fierce independence that she had cultivated like a survival skill, and who chose her, specifically and completely, every single day. Jeremiah Watkins held his wife in the kitchen of their house in Copper Creek, and outside the mountains held their ground, and inside the children slept and the fire burned and the notebooks stood in their row on the parlor shelf, 49 now and growing, each one a record of the paths that existed when the obvious ones were closed. The blizzard had sealed the mountain pass. She had remembered the lower trail. And the lower trail had led her here, to this kitchen, to this man, to this life, to all of it, every improbable and complicated and luminous bit of it, and she would not have changed a single inch of the path that had brought her to this moment. Not even the blizzard, especially not the blizzard.